Hey everyone, today we're going to be discussing how each of the killers of Dead by Daylight got their powers. Let's get into it. First off, let's talk about the characters who are pretty likely just human, but with a slightly supernatural edge. For example, Hillbilly is stated in his lore and tome lore to possess a superhuman speed when using his chainsaw. In his tome lore, it further seems that he has some form of greater strength than that of a regular human, due to his ability to take damage from a dog bite and gunshot wound without getting anything more than a limp. So I think it's safe to say he was born stronger, raised by parents who made him kill animals and strengthen himself every day. And then this was just accentuated by the entity once he got taken. Huntress is a similar situation to Billy. Looking at her tome lore and its cutscene, she appears to possess superhuman speed prior to getting taken. There are actually theories that Huntress is possibly a werewolf of some kind, and so is actually supernatural to a degree. So again, this strength was likely just accentuated by the entity. The in-game entry for her power depicts that potentially this power though is simply just from her years of surviving in the woods or taught by her mother, which I quite like, as her power is essentially her ability to throw the hatchets well. For characters like Clown, Pig, Bubba, and Deathslinger, it's pretty likely that all that's happened there is that the entity has just transferred over their equipment from the real world and replicated it inside the realm, providing Clown with his concoctions, Pig with her equipment, but also the reverse bear traps that she would be familiar with, adapting only maybe how the key is found and the placement of boxes throughout the trials to unlock the reverse bear traps, Deathslinger with his trusty rifle that he used to catch all those outlaws, and Bubba with his hammer and chainsaw. This lot don't seem to have been changed or affected at all really. However, for all killers in the realm, we can assume they've all had some form of blanket buff to strength or something like that from the entity, at least for the ones prior who were basically just normal humans. As Plague City, Babylon was hit by a plague, killing many of her people and infecting her, we can assume upon taking Adiris that the entity utilized the plague, corrupting her and adjusted it into the power we see today. The description of her power essentially just describes the power that hit Babylon and its effects, so I think all the entity did was weaponize this plague basically. From what it seems, the entity accentuated the Legion's rage or hatred for the world and made it into somewhat of a physical or inner power that could be released and acted upon. This would explain why they are stunned after using it, because it's like channeling pure rage or anger in a physical manifestation. At least that's my interpretation of where their power came from. Alternately, it states in their power description, now they draw power from the thrilling freedom of not abiding to any rule but their own, which is weird because that's not true at all, what with being trapped inside of a spider god's realm, forced to partake in its emotion trials. If we take this as the case though, it could be interpreted as the Legion gaining their power as a result of the entity giving them their freedom to do as they please, and doing this by giving them their greater speed and greatly effective stabs. I personally prefer the idea of their pure rage being weaponized into something tangible though. Let me know what you think of this one. As Victor was dead prior to the twins entering the realm, their power appears to basically be an internal respawn mechanic for Victor, where he can run out, get crushed, and then grow quickly back. So essentially the twins got their power through Victor's resurrection when in the entity's realm. Charlotte seems largely unchanged, potentially she has been altered to allow Victor's quick regrowth also. I guess now they can also detach from one another at will, which is something they weren't capable of before. All of this is definitely entity given though. Trickster appears to be mostly unchanged, as like a few others mentioned prior, he basically just has his bat and throwing knives. The throwing knives themselves do seem to have been adapted by the entity, as seen in the trials with them appearing in lockers and respawning or restocking so the Trickster can go and reload whenever he needs. The other area that Trickster appears to have been buffed in is his speed. When he activates his main event ability, he throws his knives ridiculously quickly, to the point where it seems superhuman, and so likely entity given. Aside all this, it's mainly just regular human weaponry that's been carried over. Wraith's Wailing Bell is described as a heavy cast iron bell imbued with ancient powers. In Wraith's tome lore, we discover that as a child he received a bell from his father. This bell was supposed to be used to warn his village of any attackers, so they could all retreat to their hiding spots before the attackers arrived. Philip ends up failing to do this as he's just a young and scared child. It seems he kept this bell until his adulthood, and when he was taken after killing his boss Azarov in Autohaven Wreckers, it was altered from its patterned look into a heavy and rough iron. Either this or the entity gave it to him once more, already in this altered state. So that's where the bell itself comes from. Further, the Wraith's add-ons, which are all symbols that are drawn, stamped, or painted onto the bell itself, bestow it with different powers, meaning this element is definitely entity given, and by extension his cloaking and invisibility are also from the entity. The bell is likely used though due to the great emotional impact and meaning it holds to the Wraith as a character, to remind him of his rough past life. Nurse's power is a curious one. It's described as a powerful and violent last breath snatched from the Crotus Pren Asylum warden Patrick Spencer. Channeling its energy allows the nurse to pierce and jump through the spirit world in a blink multiple times in a row. Doing so leaves her in a state of fatigue. So again, definitely largely entity given, mixed with the last breaths of the asylum's warden. I guess it's like that final breath recurringly being summoned, creating great emotion that allows Nurse her blink ability. Maybe that's the whole thing with the entity adapted powers, is that they all utilize items such as Wraith's Bell or the Warden's Last Breath to remind the wielder of their past life, creating emotion, which the entity rewards with the subsequent blink or invisibility in the Wraith's case. I only make a connection between the two because the devs have stated they are two of the most human characters, and it's greatly suggested they have some form of love for one another and so aren't devoid of empathy or emotion relating to their past life now that they're in the entity's realm. Also, they're the only two characters to interact with the spirit world. Hag's power is primarily from the hexes that she utilizes. These hexes originate from the small village she grows up in and appear to be quite ancient. It's stated in the lore that the prior inhabitants of Lisa's village were witches, who likely created the magic to begin with. Lisa uses the hexes at a young age while searching through her grandmother's things, scratching a symbol from some ancient books into her textbook. In the lore it states, she heard her mother say her grandmother had come across several books written in an unknown language with strange symbols. These symbols from the ancient book appear to be the source of the hex's power, a bit like how she scratches the triangles into the ground. After Lisa is caught by the cannibals and locked up, she scratches a symbol into the ground, and an inner hunger and darkness consumes her, which we can fairly safely interpret as the entity intervening at this point. This means the hexes are a combination of learnt witch magic and some input from the entity. Potentially the witch's magic and the strange language even originates from the entity too. Blight's power comes specifically from his tinkering and experimentation with the Blight, found in the visceral canker plants. Extracting the nectar of these plants can seemingly gift humans with quite substantial power, primarily physical power, or resistance. With Blight's prior experiments into resistance-based serums tested during the Opium War, we can assume he used this same research when approaching the nectar in the cankers. There doesn't actually seem to be any entity intervention in this situation, aside potentially providing Blight with more serum. As a result of Talbot refining the serum, he appears to have managed to make himself incredibly damage resistant as he slams into rocks, walls, and much more, and further very speedy. When described in his power, it's simply stated as unnatural physical abilities as a result of the pustular serum. Doctor's power is similar to Blight's in the sense that he's basically just carried over his research from before entering the realm into the realm. So all his research into shock therapy and such is being utilized in the realm, as seen through his add-ons, which are different research files and tapes. It would seem he looks over these to empower himself or refine the shocks to be in a certain way. Aside his research, we get a pretty outright depiction of where his power comes from. His power description stating, "The entity has ignited a corrupted and inexhaustible spark in the Doctor's heart, which allows him to generate electroconvulsive power at will. His insidious treatment corrupts the minds of those it touches. Victims shocked by the corrupt spark begin to lose their grip on reality and, with the repeated exposure, inevitably succumb to madness." Basically, the entity did it, but the Doctor's research refines the power itself. Ghostface appears to be a relatively regular guy physically, with the only supernatural element to him being the floaty bits of his outfit, which the devs have said is entity given. In-game we can read, "The Ghostface used to study his victims for weeks, meticulously registering their habits. When the urge to kill swelled, he'd know exactly how and where to strike." This suggests that Ghosty's power is purely his perception, which then allows him to get insta-downs and such. This is pretty unique, honestly. Trapper is a simple situation also, where basically the entity has taken the steel foothold traps made by Evan and duplicated them a bunch to appear throughout the trials, and that's his power essentially. The other power we can assume that Trapper has is some form of pain resistance, due to the amount of spikes that are piercing his skin. His base body piece, Rubber and Hooks, reads, "The hooks dig deep into the flesh, the pain giving way to pure rage." This suggests that the entity inflicted the Trapper with the hooks after the Trapper failed to obey it, causing constant pain to fuel him to act more on rage than reason, and so to cooperate in the trials. The Trapper, to survive this, he definitely has some kind of increased physical resistance or numbness to pain. Oni's power appears to come in the same form as Oni's from Japanese folklore, which he seems to be based on. This would mean that the entity likely has very little influence over the Oni and his powers, and that they also come from the Oni. Onis are said to be born when truly wicked humans die. In death they gain a bunch of abilities, and apparently their Cannibals become a source of great power. I looked through some different wikis and such, but I'm not sure if DBD's Oni has quite this many abilities or powers. At the very least he seems to be nerfed to a degree by the entity, honing his powers down to mainly the blood aspect, consuming blood where he can then enter a state of power with his Cannibal. His power is described in game simply as the desire to destroy weaker bloodlines shaped into a literal force. So this could possibly potentially suggest that the Oni is actually not a real or true Oni, and so is instead the entity's version of an Oni, with the Oni's blood fury being a form of weaponized rage and utilization of his desire to destroy bloodlines. It's almost like the entity read up on Onis and was like, oh hey, they're cool, and decided to make Kazan one. Spirit in a similar fashion to Oni is from Japanese folklore, and is likely from a spirit named the Onryo, which is essentially a vengeful spirit, which has come about as a result of tragedy. In the spirit's case, her need for vengeance and her anger comes from her father murdering her and her mother. This leads to her returning from death back to the land of the living to seek vengeance, now in her twisted and ghostly form. This form and her anger still remain when she's in the realm, so we can just assume that she will remain this way until she gets her revenge. That's going off of the more folklore side. In game we can instead read, Yamaoka is the name she carries from her ancestors. The spirit draws her power from their wrath, haunting the living as retribution for her suffering. So it seems from this that her power is her inner bloodline and the prior bloodshed and rage of the bloodline, feeding into her or unleashing within her or giving her this power to phase. I imagine this is a similar situation of the entity manipulating her ancestors' wrath to be more useful to her. It seems many of these entity-given powers are basically just manipulating some form of emotion and making it more powerful and into a physical or tangible power. Maya's powers and their origin is quite unclear in the 1978 Halloween. However, in films that aren't chronological to the current Halloween timeline and TBD, we learn that Myers gets his powers from the Cult of Thorn, who have granted him with immortality by possessing him with a demon called Thorn, until he kills the members of his family as a sacrifice. And that's the closest we have aside literally just saying it's a mystery though. My assumption was that his immortality came from some kind of evil possessing him. Maybe not so much a demon, but literal pure evil using a human to manifest itself. In the entity's realm, this all seems to be the case, with him acting quite similar to how he does in 1978's Halloween. His powers definitely don't seem to be manipulated or entity given at all though. Freddy's powers in a similar fashion to Myers are kind of unclear. It does seem like he refuses to completely die in a sense, due to his large amount of rage resulting in him becoming a dream demon after he is burned to death. I also read that the memory of Freddy is what keeps him alive and able to become a dream demon. The memory of his horrible deeds means he still has that connection to the real world. From what I can tell, he's basically an evil, horrible guy, and as a result he became a dream demon in death where he could do more evil and horrible things, and enabling his control over the dream world. In game, his power is stated like this: death won't accept him and thus he remains. A calamity, indisputable master of his victims' nightmares. Basically, he was too evil to be accepted into death, and so he became a dream demon. In the entity's realm, his powers seem stunted by the entity substantially, only allowing the dream world to be used for confusion purposes mainly. Nemesis was created by implanting the Any Alpha parasite into a host Tyrant 103 body, which is a human bioweapon, resulting in a strong creature capable of taking orders and wielding weapons. Nemesis is supposedly the only one of his kind to have actually seen any combat and tested. He appears to basically be this way in the entity's realm, except maybe with the entity somewhat stunting some of his infection-based abilities and not giving him any weapons to use. Yep, that's it. Mostly biological though. Demogorgon appears to basically just be born with its powers, potentially given them by its own entity, the Mind Flayer. It's established that Demo broke into our world from the Upside Down after 11 came into contact with it, where it then climbed through the portal that was created as a result of this connection. Once that initial connection was made, it seems it can just place portals and tunnel between the Upside Down and the Right Way Up at will. This means this same thing is happening in the entity's realm more than likely, where a connection was made between two different dimensions. It was bridged with the portal, and here Demo is. So its portal power remaining intact, as well as its great strength and speed. There isn't any obvious entity interference here aside the usual slight stunting of strength. Cenobite gains his powers after coming into contact with the Lament configuration. As a human, he solved the puzzle and was dragged to the labyrinth. labyrinth, and then transformed into a Cenobite. After this, he is tasked by Leviathan with collecting anyone who solves the Lament configuration and bringing them to the labyrinth, which is this spooky maze place. While serving Leviathan, Pinhead was immortal, could teleport, disguise himself as others, and transform other people into Cenobites. This is the same state he appears to be in-game, with a few restrictions to the teleportation and such by the entity. These powers mainly come from Leviathan though, I would assume. Executioner is a really tricky one, as his powers don't seem all too consistent with his Silent Hill self. He clearly has the basics of immortality, increased strength, etc. However, in the Entity's realm and Dead by Daylight's version of him, he represents something much greater than a creation of James Sunderland. Instead, he is an executioner fixated on dispensing punishment through pain. He does this to those who need to repent for something, such as guilt, and based on the lore, he basically handshakes with the Entity to come and dispense some punishments in its realm. In the realm, Pyramid Head appears to not only gain power from the Entity, with new abilities appearing in his weapons like the Great Knife, carving trails and such, but also bringing in abilities of his own like the cages and his own moments of defiance in the Final Judgment ability. He seems to have a blend of his Silent Hill stuff, some Entity stuff, and also some new stuff he's learned through his years of being a Punisher and Executioner. Alright, well that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and please do drop your own thoughts down below. Thanks, and goodbye.